Welcome to this webinar from Interactive Services. The title of the webinar is Compliance to Performance, How Great Compliance Training Can Protect Your Business. First of all, thank you for joining us today. I see we have about 20 people on board, plus the 4 of us presenting. That's a good crowd. Thank you very much again. I'm joined today by Damien DeBarra, who's our Head of Instructional Design, and by Kai Marriott, the Senior Learning Manager. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. There are too many people on the line to do anything other than broadcast, but we would like to address questions. So if you have questions, please message them to John O'Brien in the control panel, and if we see them as we go through, we'll try and answer them as we go. If we don't, we'll wrap up on as many as we can at the end. We expect this call to last about 45 minutes. We'll try and keep it to that time, and hopefully you'll be able to stay with us for the duration. So the question we put up on the first slide, before we start talking about compliance and performance, is what is culture? You may be familiar with this quote. It's a quote from Herb Kelleher, chairman of Southwest Airlines. If anyone has ever done any kind of MBA course, they'll know that Southwest Airlines are the golden boy of business training because they do things so well. And Herb said, culture is what people do when no one is looking. And there's been a lot of discussion in the training industry of late around the idea of a culture of compliance, what that means and what it can do for a business. That's not completely what we're here to talk about today, but it really does tie in, because I think if you are thinking of compliance as a tick box exercise and you're using the carrot and the stick to ensure those boxes get ticked, you will satisfy the regulator, but when no one's looking, people will go back to doing what they've always done. But our proposition for today is that if your training focuses on behavior, it doesn't focus on ticking the box, it focuses on individual behavior of the employee. Then you can change your culture, and if you can change your culture, then people will do the right thing even when no one is looking. And that really has to be the goal for compliance training. So what are we going to do today? Well, we want these sessions to be practically useful for you. We want you to be able to take away from these sessions something that you can use immediately and certainly feed into your design and development over the next few months. But we are going to start by looking at behavior itself, and we'll have 10 minutes on some strategy behind behavior and behavior change. Then we'll dive into 4 or 5 examples of what that looks like in practice. Now, our focus will be mainly online learning. We do compliance training, which involves a blend of online and classroom, but most compliance training is online because of the tracking and scoring capability. So that's where we'll keep our focus. And Kai's going to introduce us to 5 really, really good methods that you can use to ensure your compliance training focuses on behavior. And we've got a few examples of those we can share. In terms of a takeaway, we've tried to package everything we're talking about into simple steps and take away to your own training design and development. 4 steps to better compliance training is how we'll finish up on this thing. And so we're clear on what the opportunity is here. Here's an example of what it looks like when it works. So when compliance training goes beyond ticking the box and into behavior change, what's the opportunity for the business? Well, we together a food safety program for Walmart. As a result, they are recording higher food safety standards in stores, which means safer food for tens of millions of people. And interestingly, that piece in green at the top of the slide, that's not the piece the regulator looks at. The regulator is looking at the FDA exam pass rate, which we can see in the second blue bullet, rose from 86 to 93%, so that's a win. Walmart are looking at productivity hours, which rose hugely through a reduced training time. That, they estimate a return on investment of about $2.5 million, which is fantastic for a piece of compliance training. But for me, the really important metric here is that top one. However they measured food safety in Walmart, and they measure it in various different ways, food safety standards have improved. And that means that even when no one's looking, people are doing the right thing. So this is an example of what happens when it works. You get the best of both worlds. You satisfy your regulator, you protect your company, and you have genuine behavior change, which can be measured and can be seen to impact the business. Here's a quote from Plato. Human behavior flows from 3 sources: emotion, knowledge, and desire. What does that mean in practice? It means that the way people feel about things, the knowledge that they feel to be true, and the desire they have pretty much adds up to the behavior that they exhibit. And I'm going to show you 2 examples from real life, which you'll probably recognize. If we think back to the 1950s, or what we know of the 1950s, particularly anyone who's a fan of the show Mad Men, and we think about smoking cigarettes, we'll realize that in the 1950s, people's feelings and knowledge and desires around smoking were very different to the way they were today. At the time in the 1950s, pretty much everyone smoked. It was completely socially acceptable. That was the feeling. The knowledge was that smoking wasn't harmful. Doctors said it was okay. And the desire was, of course, people wanted to fit in. So what's the inevitable behavior? The inevitable behavior is that people chose to smoke cigarettes. In our modern world, fewer people smoke, some still do, but it's much less socially acceptable, especially indoors. The knowledge has completely changed. We now know it's harmful. Our doctors would always advise against it. And our desire is to stay healthy. So most of us would make a choice not to smoke. And that's a huge cultural shift that's happened in the last 30 or 40 years. And it's a cultural shift that's come about because the emotion changed, the knowledge changed, the desire changed, and as a result of that, the behavior changed. Here's another example we'll probably be familiar with. Again, if we look back a few generations, we'll note that many people would have a drink or drink alcohol and then get in a car and drive. And the feeling was that it's okay, I'll just have a few, I'll be absolutely fine. Why? Because people believed, the knowledge they had, they believed that they drove pretty well after a drink. Some people would have said they drove a little bit better. They also believed, and they were probably right, that the law was more relaxed about drink driving. And the desire was that they didn't want to have their fun restricted. They don't want to go to a party and not drink. They don't want to come out of a party and realize they have to get a taxi home and pay that expense. They don't want their fun restricted. The inevitable behavior is you choose to drink and drive. Well, again, through advertising, through all sorts of campaigns, that's changed. And in our modern world, it's much less socially acceptable to have a drink and get in the car. And many of us would feel, well, I couldn't live with myself if I was responsible for an accident, if I'd had a drink and someone was hurt. Now our knowledge has changed. We mostly feel that we drive pretty badly when we're drunk, and we know the law takes it very seriously. Our desire has changed. We want to look after ourselves and others, and we want to stay out of jail. So what's the choice we make? It's to not drink and drive. So these are two examples from the real world that I think we can associate with. How does that relate to compliance training? Well, here's a few things we notice when we talk about compliance and when we start talking to end users of compliance training before the training. In terms of the emotion, how they feel, we notice that people cut corners for the business's sake. So there aren't always selfish reasons for people not being compliant. Quite often they think they're doing their job better. They're cutting corners because they want to get the project finished. They think it's good for the business. They're also thinking, I'm not a criminal. This has nothing to do with me. And they certainly don't want to get a reputation for telling lies. So there's a strong emotional pull to not exhibit that compliance behavior we're looking for when no one's looking. The knowledge is sometimes off as well. They genuinely believe that compliance is about pleasing the regulator. They don't think it could impact them personally. They certainly don't think it could affect their job. And they don't really believe that their behavior has much impact on others. They see the high-profile headlines in the paper, but they think, well, that's not me. That'll never be me. And the desire, well, they want to focus on the proper work. They want to get this compliance training done as fast as possible and get out of there. The inevitable behavior, they don't pay too much attention to the training, and they're only compliant when they have to be. What are we looking for? Well, on the emotional side, we want people to feel that what they do matters, that speaking up, actually, instead of gaining a reputation for telling tales, it's something that can help protect their peers, protect the company. It's everyone's business. The knowledge piece is important as well. They need to know that compliance is woven into everything they do, that they could be personally impacted, and that their behavior does affect others. And the desire, they want to get it right. And this compliance training should feel like a resource. They should want more of it. If we can get those things right in our training, then the behavior that follows on is that people will pull as much compliance training as they can towards them, and they'll focus on compliance even when no one's watching. Later on, we're going to look at some practical examples of this, but I think it's important to understand what goes into changing a behavior. It's really not only about practice, it's also about addressing some of these misconceptions. What we're doing when we look at these ideas of emotion, knowledge, and desire is we're really working out what our key messages are going to be. What are the 5 or 6 key messages that we're going to hammer home again and again in our piece of training? From the very first sentence that they read or hear to the very last sentence in the summary, we're going to make sure they get these messages that focus on the emotions we want to see, the knowledge that we want them to have, the desire we want them to have that will lead to the behavior we're looking for. Now, the next piece is about performance. So a lot of compliance training focuses on the regulator. It focuses on learning to pass tests and satisfy regulators. That's a very different outlook and a very different approach to taking a piece of training than if you enter it with a performance focus and you think, oh, well, I'm learning to acquire skills to achieve goals. if your courses encourage knowledge focus, the best you can ever hope for is someone will pass a test to satisfy a regulator. And that is a tick in the box. But if your training focuses on performance, you're actually teaching people skills to achieve business goals. And that's when you start getting that culture piece. That's when the compliance starts weaving itself into daily behavior. Again, some of the examples we'll show will be around how do we do this? Having done the emotion, the knowledge, and the desire piece, and having identified the fact that we want performance focus, what does that actually look like? So to summarize where we are so far in this presentation, the first thing we're going to do is identify the gap between the existing and the preferred emotions, knowledges, and desires. What do we want people to feel, know, and want? The second piece is about making sure our training targets behavior rather than knowledge. We want them doing, not just knowing. And for that to happen, we have to make it real. And the way you make it real is with performance-focused activity. All the activities in our training should relate to real-life examples. So we're going to take a look at some real-life examples now. In a moment, I'm going to ask Kai to walk us through some of his thoughts around what makes a great compliance training course. We have another polling question. I'm going to take a chance and see if it works. And if it doesn't, we will move on. Okay. So I've launched this. Hopefully you'll be able to jump in and show me how you feel. Yeah, it seems to be working now. That's really interesting. So I mean, I've asked the question, do we, based on what we've seen so far, how confident would we feel about going and creating some compliance training right now? And the general consensus seems to be you're all with it so far, but some examples would really help, and that's what we're going to look at right now. Okay, Kai, I'm going to introduce Kai Merritt. He's a senior learning manager. Kai has been working on trying to identify what are the elements that go into great compliance training. And Kai, are you ready to take over now and walk us through your 5 steps?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so these 5 things are really the culmination of sort of years of doing training and overall, and certainly compliance training. And if there was one overall way to improve training, it's that you know, you create something that a learner can just immediately apply to their role. And that's really the goal. That's really what we're trying to do here. And to do that, I think we have these 5 sort of must-have items, I think. So number 1, good training really should be focused on performance. So the training itself, rather than just giving people knowledge, which is great, and this is building on what Matt said earlier, we're really trying to get people to do things rather than just to know things. I think number 2 is providing interactions that are meaningful. So not just asking questions for the sake of asking questions, for instance, and in e-learning and training, there's a lot of that around. But really asking people to complete tasks that can then be applied to their job. So for instance, tasks that apply to real-life situations, not just memory tests. One very common example is, in what year did something happen? And that's great. You might be able to remember the date, but it's not really of any practical use. It might be interesting, but it's not very practical. The third one is we think that bringing in a theme, some sort of thread that continues throughout the training. So that could be just a general design theme. It could be an actual story, and that's very common in training. Some sort of story that progresses, particularly interesting stories, something that's, you know, dare I say, gripping, or even a game, so some sort of feeling of progression, but most importantly, some feeling that you're getting from A to B within a piece of training. So that just makes the learner more engaged, because you could have, for instance, they're in a world of some description. It could be that they're in a room or in a town or something like that. So it's just something that brings all of the information together into something that feels like they're progressing. And what we want to avoid, and again something very common, is where topics are just bolted together. So you say, here's some information, and now here's some quite unrelated information, and so on and so forth. So really some sort of thread that runs throughout. The fourth thing is that you design with the audience in mind. And this is a really, really important thing, and I run a lot of design workshops right at the beginning of projects, and one thing I ask is about the audience. What do they look like? It's basically around literacy, where they are in the world, how old they are. They're an older audience and a younger audience, experienced, inexperienced, that sort of thing. And once you know the audience, you then choose visuals and words, meaning you write in a way that appeals directly to your audience, and they're much more likely to think, well, yes, this is for me. What you want to avoid is inappropriate visuals, pictures, or words that either you think, this is very simplistic, too simplistic for me, or that are baffling, and you think, I have no idea what's happening here. So if you pitch it directly to the audience, they're much more likely to then take that into the real world. And then finally, the ideal thing is that you come up with a follow-up activity at the end, meaning that the learning doesn't stop once the training stops. It's not, okay, that's the end of this course, click exit. It's more, okay, so now you've learned what you've learned. Here are some things you can do over the next week, month, year, whatever. Just some sort of task that you can take into the real world. So you're making that sort of seamless progression rather than just seeing it as a standalone bit of training. So if you could move on to the next slide. Just to give you an example, number one example, we're actually going to show you a few examples, but I'm just going to talk you through the first one because this is a work in progress for Walmart. This training is for Walmart managers, and the idea is that a couple of years ago they did some e-learning on equal opportunities training. So the idea is that they want to teach their staff to treat their employees fairly. Now that isn't actually all that cut and dried. It's not actually a very easy topic because what is fair in two people who have completely different experiences and completely different situations, how can you ensure they are acting fairly? This particular work in progress, this isn't actually the final thing, is all about the activities. In fact, there's no real information screen in there. There's only questions, and it's all built around people asking you questions. And you can see here that we've brought in a fairness meter, and the idea of that is that when you go through the course and answer questions from employees, the fairness meter goes up or down, depending on whether you get the answer right or wrong. So if we move to the next question, next screen, sorry, and you can see a question here. Obviously, you're losing a lot here because you can't see what's happening. But the idea is that an employee has come to you. You learn a little bit about the situation. Then they ask you a question directly, and then you have to give a very specific answer. And the thing with this is that the answers are not obvious, and that's actually really important, that they're challenging. So when you answer the question, I'm not sure if you've got the feedback. Oh, there we go. Yeah. You then get some feedback on why you're wrong and what you should have done instead. And all of the questions in this course are realistic, and they all map back to the legal side of things, so the law on equal opportunities training. So it's all very tightly mapped. So moving on to the next screen. Is there another screen? Is that the last one?
It's the last one in that example. Yeah, thank you, Kai.
Okay.
So that was great. That's around the performance focus, which was Kai's first point. This is an example of the second point, which is around meaningful interactions. I'll tell you what a non-meaningful interaction is. It's clicking on something to see more of something. I mean, that is not an interaction. That's just hiding information. And I think when an interaction is meaningful, it means it makes you think, and it makes you think about yourself and the way you behave, or it makes you realize that you perhaps don't know quite as much about the subject as you thought you did. Here's one example. When we put together a course for Intel on inclusive management, the very first thing we did was we asked the learner to think about what kind of manager they are. So we gave them 5 management ideas, and we said, how often do you do this? Never, sometimes, always. And all it does is it helps them build a quick picture of their readiness for this course. Never is what you're hoping they don't say. Always is what you're looking for. If they tick always, then we can respond by saying, well, that's fantastic. Looks like you are already an inclusive manager, but please do pay attention to this course because it will help you be an even better manager. If they're mostly nevers or sometimes, we can say, well, you know, you've come to the perfect place because you obviously want to be an inclusive manager, but there's something you can learn. So this kind of interactivity at the beginning of a course, there's no right and wrong answer, but it is an opportunity for the learner to measure themselves and assess their readiness for the course. And in terms of engaging a learner in a subject they're not particularly interested in, there's nothing better than getting them thinking about themselves, because we all like to think about ourselves. Here's another example of what I'd say is a meaningful interactivity. This was a compliance and ethics course that we put together for a client. We open up, without any preamble in terms of policy or what the course will cover, with a game. And the game introduces an ethical barometer. The ethical barometer is on the left. We fire real-life situations at the learner as they move through their day. You can see on the right they're moving between 9 o'clock and 7 in the evening. And for every answer they give or every decision they make, that ethical barometer will go up and down. You want it to fill up with green. You don't want it to fall down so it hits the red. And what you're doing there is just giving them a temperature check on their own ethical behavior and ethical opinions. And it's a very nice lead-in to a course that talks about some of the grey area around ethical behavior. And of course this is compliance, so there's no grey area in the policy. The policy is absolutely cut and dried. The grey area comes when we try to apply the policy. And I think the best compliance courses look at that tension between the policy, which is very cut and dried, and the reality of trying to live the policy in your business life, which is far less black and white, and there's a lot more grey area. So this would be another example of what I'd say is a meaningful activity. And Damien, can I ask you to talk us through what we mean when we talk about theme and story?
So our third principle that Kai was discussing was about using theme or story or indeed games to create engagement and immerse the learner, and as Kai said, to kind of bring the learner on a journey. This is an initial screenshot from a product we did for Visa about a year and a half ago around in the world of compliance around information security. And on the first screen, the learner was asked to type in their name. Once they do type their name in and click submit, they're then brought into a title sequence which shows them that they are essentially the agent within a secret mission-like game where they're going to travel around the world to 5 locations that have problems and then diagnose what the issue is. So it very much took a kind of 1960s, I wouldn't call it James Bond, but more kind of Mission Impossible feel. There was some kind of spooky spy music going on. You take on the role of an agent, and the name that you typed in, if I typed in my name, would reappear and say, you know, the such and such a movie starring Damien Debarra. If we can move on, there we go. And we see here our 5 missions. You can see that we've done mission 1 here, and it's to refer back again to what Kai said earlier on about taking the learner on a journey. We like to show people going on a journey and a path. It's a method to bolt together, as Kai says, the what could be diverse topics or information. And then if we move on to the next image there, please. Here we have a decision point, and again circling back to this business of the making the learner perform and making them produce. So rather than simply pushing the information at the learner, we ask them to make a decision based in the context of a story, a little bit of a fantastical one in this case, and then to produce or to perform, to come up with an answer. And it's because there's an old phrase in our business we're fond of saying, which is that information is not instruction. That focusing on performance and focusing on getting the learner to produce is a much more meaningful way of getting new learning or new content to basically get from short-term memory into long-term memory. It's a psychological trick, but very easy to do, but very effective. And in this particular instance here, the learner is asked to select true and false values for what they think is the right thing to do. And if they were to click on retry and get it wrong, they actually can't progress any further until they get it correct. So much like a game you would in any video game, you can't go to level 2 till you defeated the big boss on level 1. And again, we wanted to go for that kind of immersive sensation of being inside a world, atmospheric sound effects and music, and very much immerse the learner inside and get them engaged. So we can move on to the next image there, please. This is another example of a compliance product, again with a game approach. This time very much on a board game kind of theme. Anybody's ever played Monopoly might find this a little bit familiar. The idea being, the start of the game, you choose your token. The token chosen here is the little truck, which will, you roll the dice down there, which you click on, the truck will bounce its way happily along the squares. The different squares reveal different things, and those little different things relate to the riskometer up in the top corner. So what you would do at the start of the course is you'd be given a quick quiz, a diagnostic tool that asks you 10 questions, and that says, well, based on your answers, we reckon you're this level of ready on this subject. So you're going to have to do 5 stars, 3 videos, and 4 little mini quizzes. So if we land on a star, I think we would be given a multiple choice question off one of the Integris cards there. Landing on a video square would show us a video which we have to watch, figure out what's wrong in the situation between the characters, and then answer a question. If you get something wrong, you can end up in jail. You can see your jail square there in the left-hand corner, and to get out of jail, you have to basically perform another activity or task and make your way out. And the aim of the game is to complete those activities, get the riskometer to reduce from orange down to a very happy green looking color. And again, it's just immersing that learner in the world using a theme or a story or a game. And this was a product which had considerable success and really fantastic reaction from the learners who we gave it to. So we can move on to the next one. Here's another very different type of product. Under this banner, though, really this is principle number 4, as you can see in the top left corner. They're talking about designing for the right audience. And as Kai said earlier, this is ever so important that we understand the audience that we're delivering to and design something quite correctly for them. So in this instance, the audience in question, it was a compliance course, but the audience in question were probably between 25 and 35 years of age. This course then took a kind of investigative detective theme. Based on, we often ask our clients, what kind of movies and games and TV shows do you think these learners are watching? And oftentimes we kind of look into those things and wrap a theme around something suitable for them. And again, you can see here all that stuff we've been talking about is embodied. You're the focus on performance. You're being asked to make decisions, and you're being asked to produce the new information or learning in the context of a real scenario. And this kind of, also, you're not hearing it, but this course had some kind of spooky music playing in the background, which all added to the ambience. If we move on to our next image, very different kind of client, very different kind of audience. This audience would have been a bit older, probably folks between 35 and maybe 60 years of age. Also, we were aware, very consciously aware, that this was an audience that was quite time poor. They, get me to the content was one of the things we heard a lot during our analysis phases. And so the approach we took with this was to, first of all, in terms of visuals, you might recognize the kind of 60s Saul Bellow or Mad Men look. Again, circling back around to that kind of thing of what kind of audience are we dealing with. But in terms of instructional approach, we wanted the learner or the user to have the experience that they would feel like they just spent 15 or 20 minutes in the company of a very articulate and very smart colleague who had given them a sort of super briefing on what the subject matter was. And if we can maybe move on there. And then finally, for number 5, we talked about including a follow-up activity. Another phrase you often hear when you talk to interactive services staff is that learning is not an event, that learning is actually a process. And the more we know for fairly solidly that if we can extend the learning process beyond the formal event, and by the formal event I mean the online course or perhaps the classroom session, if we can make something happen on the job, then we know that that learning has a much greater chance of sticking. So in this example here, this is the final screen in an Intel course where we're told, right, you're done, you passed your little assessment, well done, but you've got a couple of things to do after this, and here are some resources and some activities for you to do afterwards. What's also particularly powerful is if we can get that activity which you do validated by a manager or a mentor or a leader back on the job. That's really very powerful. Another example here from Walmart. At the end of the course, you're asked to print off a study guide, and the study guide can be downloaded as a PDF or printed off, and it's full of not just a summary of the course materials you've gone through, but some very practical activities that you then have to carry out on the shop floor, as it were, and have those looked at by a mentor or a leader and have them validated. So that's a 5 quick examples or embodiments of the kind of principles we were talking about, and hopefully some food for thought.
Thank you, Damien. That's great. Okay, so we're going to have a quick look in the last 5 or 6 minutes, about how we pull all this together and make it happen. We've seen some examples of how you can make sure that the interactions in your e-learning courses are meaningful and are performance-focused and behavior-focused rather than knowledge-focused, which is fantastic. We want you to be able to take away 4 or 5 easy steps to make it happen. We've got 4 of them here. So the first one is around this idea of the emotion, knowledge, and desire. So identify the preferred emotions, knowledge, and desires. Why? Well, because those are your key messages. Those will turn into the 4 or 5 key messages that you hammer the audience with throughout the course. The idea being that if you can change the way they feel about something and you can change their sense of what they feel they know and what they want, then their behavior will automatically change. The second piece is around action mapping, and I have a slide on that for anyone who's not familiar with it next. Action mapping is about reversing the traditional way of approaching training, which is you start with our content and you say, well, we have this content, now what kind of course are we going to build? And instead of that, you say, well, let's forget about the content for now. We're going to start with the behaviors we want to see, and then we'll find the content that matches those behaviors. A lot of training is created by the tail wagging the dog, and we want to reverse that, obviously. The third piece is around identifying learner interactions that deliver. So you've done your theoretical piece, you've worked out what your emotions, knowledge, and desires are, you've worked out what your practice activities should be, but of course this needs to end up as an e-learning course or some kind of online delivery. So the next piece is to convert that theory into actual learning interactions. What kind of screen types are you going to use? What technologies would you use? How are you going to put it together? How will you deliver the feedback? This is when the rubber hits the road and you actually start creating. And finally, how do you hold all these things together? Well, that's where your theme comes in, whether it's your story or your game. It's the glue that pulls all these things into a cohesive course and keeps people's attention until the very end. So we mentioned the action mapping. Action mapping was created, or was at least named, by someone called Kathy Moore. She has a fantastic blog, and you can see the link in the bottom right. And I would encourage anyone who isn't familiar with her work to take a look. Action mapping is very simple. We don't start with the content. We don't start with the SME's requirements in terms of what they feel should go into the course. That all comes later. We start with the behaviors we're looking for. So in this example, we've said, well, one of the behaviors in our course is to identify red flags related to anti-money laundering. We're going to identify 6 or 7 behaviors for this anti-money laundering course, and if we know that if we can change those 6 or 7 behaviors, we're going to see a huge uplift in performance around that particular area of compliance. So we've identified the behavior. The next thing to say is, well, in terms of training, what practice activity would help us practice that behavior? Well, in this case, it's probably some kind of simulation, a business scenario where we have some correct behavior and some red flags, and the learner needs to start spotting the red flags and identifying red flags and what we should do with them. Having decided our behavior and our practice activity, now finally we start looking at content. So now we say, well, to teach this behavior, we must have this simulation practice activity. To create the simulation practice activity, here's the information I need from my SMEs. I'm going to need a scenario setting, tell me where it would happen, the kind of job roles involved, who would the client be, what's likely to happen. Give me a list of correct actions and give me the red flags that I'm going to need to post so the learner can spot them. And also show me which part of the policy, compliance policy, relates to this particular behavior. So you'll notice that we've twisted what can be the traditional model, where we sit down at the beginning of a course and the client will often say, well, I have these 50 PowerPoints, I have these 4 policy documents, I have 10 SMEs who are absolute experts and they've got hours worth of experience in their heads. And you can end up with 20 hours plus of content for your 45-minute e-learning course. We would say, park the content, start with the behaviors. There probably aren't more than 6 or 7 that you need to hit. When you know what they are, it becomes very easy to decide what your practice activities should be. When you know what your practice activities should be, then you know which information you're going to need to write them. If your e-learning course just focuses on those 6 behaviors, it will be so much more effective than if the starting point is the huge stack of content and PowerPoints. We're almost up on time. I want to keep us honest on the time. In summary, we started by saying that culture is what people do when no one's looking. If we want them to do the right thing when no one's looking, we have to change their behavior. To change behavior, you identify their emotions, knowledge, and desires, how they feel, what they know, and what they want. And then you create training that targets behavior. How do you do it? Well, you make it real with this performance-focused activity. You use meaningful interactions. And to help you do that, this action mapping technique can be very, very useful. And if you can also lay a theme over the top of all that, you create a glue that glues it all together into a cohesive experience. And finally, if you want to know whether it's worked or not, our recommendation would be find something that the business is already measuring in this area. And I don't mean test scores and regulator box ticks. I mean a business metric that the business is measuring already around compliance. So it could be the number of red flags that have been found, the number of fines that have been paid out if it's a serious compliance issue. Work out what the metric is now and then measure it again in 6 months and see if the course has made a difference. I hope this has been useful. It was a quick introduction to some of our thinking. You're very welcome to have this presentation. Please ask John if you'd like us to send it out to you. And if anyone has any questions, now would be a good time to throw them into the hopper by sending them to John. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time today. 45 minutes is quite a chunk out of the day, and we really appreciate you joining us. So we have a question from Patrick. What were the majority of these courses built with, and how do you track learners' answers? So they will be built with a combination. The older ones are built in Flash. The newer ones are built in HTML. Regardless, they're all SCORM compliant, and they're tracked by our clients' LMS, learning management systems. So that would generally track who's opened the course, how many pages have they visited, what was their test score, and how long did they spend in the course. Those are all the traditional metrics. There isn't an e-learning development tool out there that doesn't package for SCORM, as far as I'm aware. So whether you're using Lectora or Storyline or any of the other tools, you should be able to produce a SCORM compliant package that the learning management system will be able to track. Question from Peter. What are the pros and cons for testing for knowledge behavior for regulatory training? I think with regulatory training, you can only test behavior in an online course to a certain extent because you can only simulate scenarios where that behavior can be exhibited. You can certainly test where people have understood, and you can test their assessment of how they're going to use this in the workplace. The reason we showed the example of the food safety at the beginning of this webinar is it was a blended program. It was mostly online, but it also had job aids and also webinar components as well. So it was all the more powerful because people could actually practice out on the floor and they could practice in the webinars, and the facilitators were able to get a real sense of whether people had understood the correct behaviors that needed to be modeled. Thanks everyone for joining. We're up on the time right now, so I'm going to call time on this. Thanks for your attendance. Goodbye.